Welcome to this little mini lesson on Little Boy Crying by Mervyn Morris. So this is a relatively new poem. It was published in 2006. It's one of the newest in the IGCSE collection if you're watching the video doing that collection. And generally, it's good to kind of analyze it from the point of view that it's quite modern and it's exploring attitudes to parenting in modern times. So because it's so new, I don't want to reproduce the poem here in case it's in copyright or there's some sort of rules about like me not reading it aloud. I'm sure it would be fine, but I don't want to risk it. So what I'm gonna say to do instead of me reading the poem like I normally do with the scriptly videos is just read it yourself aloud. Maybe pause the video now and read it either in your head or aloud, ideally aloud to yourself, just to give you a refresher of what it sounds like before we move on to the story. And also, while you're doing that, make sure that there's no vocab that you don't understand. If there is, look it up and write down a definition before you start. When you're ready, we're going to move on to the story/summary. So, hopefully, you paused me, or if you've not, you've read the poem recently. And yeah, we're going to start with what happens in these stanzas. So, there's 4 stanzas in total. They're not equal line length, and we'll have a look at that in a minute, why that is. The first thing I want to say is the attitudes are quite controversial in this poem. They're not like necessarily standard attitudes that every parent would have or that every person has towards how you should be a parent and how you should treat your children and so on. So it's controversial, and I don't want you to think of that as bad or to think of it as like an awful poem or not moral, something like that. I want you to actually engage, try and get your brain to kind of engage with this idea of like discipline and how should you discipline children, and is this an inappropriate way to discipline children? So try and treat it maturely and take it with its own merit and try and understand why the poet feels like his actions were justified, and then decide for yourself whether you think that this is justifiable or not. Personally, I would probably say not if I had a 3-year-old child. But it doesn't mean that it's not a good poem, and it definitely doesn't mean that there's not a lot we can analyze here and learn from. So, part of poetry is getting different perspectives on how to live and different cultures and their attitudes to different things like parenting or love or marriage or relationships or whatever. So this is one of those that makes you think a lot about it. And when I first read it, I was actually I think I was quite shocked because I'm quite against disciplining physically little children, especially if you're like a father and you're kind of big or whatever. Um, I was actually disciplined that way as a child, and I have a nice relationship with my father now. And yeah, there's definitely no like molesting. That's how it is. And my father's Pakistani as well, so he was disciplined that way himself, and it's not like he wasn't a bad father because of that or anything. But my personal choice, if I had children, would be to not behave this way, but also that discipline is really necessary. So I think that we've got this like extreme kind of way of thinking about discipline where like it's always negative or it upsets children or shouldn't do it. That I think is equally as bad, if not worse, than physically disciplining a child. So we'll explore that later, and I'll give you my opinions on that as well. I want you to think of your own opinions and develop. Like, imagine if you had a 3-year-old child, or if you do have a 3-year-old child now, or even a sibling, brother or sister. How do you control them, and how do you get them to understand the rules of your world? Because it is really important that they learn these messages as they grow up. So, with all that in mind, which I thought I'd explore before we jump into the first line of the stanza, we're going to have a look at what happens in stanza 1 now. So, in stanza 1, we realize that the father has hit a 3-year-old child and the boy is crying. The poet is the father, so he's speaking from the point of view of the parent. And he says that the boy was happy and relaxed, but now has turned tense and upset. So there's a massive shift in the behavior of the boy following the shock of the action that the father um, bestowed upon him. So the boy looks for guilt or sorrow in the father as well. So, as well as being upset, the boy is looking for a sign in the father that he feels bad about what he's done. In stanza 2, remember this is actually spoken from the father's perspective, not the child's perspective, but the father is saying, "You probably see me as an ogre because of my size being so large compared to you when you're 3, and my seeming cruelty because you can't understand. Maybe I create fear in you." We realize that the boy hates the father at this point because he doesn't understand the reason for the discipline, and he also really can't understand why the father doesn't feel bad for what he's done. And the boy maybe imagines getting revenge for this action. In stanza 3, it kind of shifts a little bit on the debate or the perspective on this way of disciplining. So we realize that the boy is too young to understand that he can also hurt the father. And the father is actually pretending to feel nothing, but he feels awful on the inside about what he's done. So it's a difference between seeming one way and actually feeling another. And the father's doing this in order to be a good discipliner. So in his mind, he thinks that this is the right way to raise the boy and to discipline him. And his instincts as a father make him want to pick the boy up and play with him, make him happy, cuddle him, make him feel better. But if he does all that, the boy isn't going to learn a lesson. So it's an important conundrum that the father's stuck in, and the action actually makes the father suffer as much as the boy, even though the boy doesn't realize this. So the poem ends with a single line about how we should take the rain seriously. I'm actually going to quote this line to you. "You must not make a plaything of the rain." Perhaps this is a metaphor, suggesting that something we don't like can be important still and it can be good for us. So the father wants to play with the boy and he doesn't want to discipline him, but he actually needs to discipline him and he needs to not play with him. So he needs him to learn and take that discipline seriously. So the reaction that you should be having right now, probably, if you're similar to me, is like you're very confused because you're like, I mean, from my perspective anyway, in my culture, I feel like it's not right to hit a child, especially a 3-year-old. You don't know how hard it is, so we assume that it's not, causing any lasting damage. It's not severe, but just that kind of physical act of violence to me for such a young child is not appropriate, or probably any child, to be honest. That's just not my opinion of discipline. So I've got this kind of confusion in my head between, like, the idea that you shouldn't do that to discipline a child, and then actually, I personally agree with Mervyn Morris on his attitude to parenting or his attitude to discipline, even though I don't agree with that physical act. Don't know if this is making sense. Hopefully, it is. So I don't think you should physically hurt children, but I feel like you should discipline them, and that he's right that there are times with parenting where you should actually not just play with them all the time and make them feel happy and comfort them when they're sad, but you should allow them sometimes to be sad or upset or angry with you because they're learning a lesson. And I think that that's quite a complex attitude to parenting. A lot of parents miss, actually. You can think about your own parents and also think about what kind of parent you would be if you had kids. So I don't have kids, but um, I look after quite a lot of kids. Obviously, I work with children and students and things, although they're quite a lot older. And like nieces and nephews that I hang out with a lot. And I have lots of animals in my house, so I'm used to having things that are younger than me and smaller than me, and needing to discipline them as well as wanting to cuddle them all the time and play with them and love them and stuff. So, yeah, so it's important, I think, this message about taking discipline seriously. Even though I don't agree with the action, I agree with the sentiment, the idea behind it. And I want you to think about your stance on this poem before we move on. So, If it, requires you to sit and think for a minute, feel free to pause and take your time. But we're going to analyze it after you've kind of developed your own opinion, because once you have your opinion on a poem, it becomes a lot easier to analyze and to write essays on that poem. So you might totally agree, and you might come from a culture where that's completely acceptable and you totally understand Mervyn Morris's point of view. You might part agree, like me, but you might totally disagree and think, you really shouldn't discipline children in this way. It's harmful. It's going to be traumatic, all that kind of thing. So it depends on your background and your personality and your experience of the world. And it allows you to analyze the poem in different ways. And for a high level grade, when you're writing an essay, you need to be aware of different interpretations and perspectives. So, one thing that's really brilliant about this poem is you can get tons of different interpretations from it, and lots of different people, even within the same classroom, probably would disagree with whether this is a positive or negative poem, and whether the final message of the poem is right or not. So, it's quite interesting from that point of view, when you can remove your initial sort of shock of like what's happened and actually analyze it in a more unemotional way. So, we're going to have a quick look at a couple of different angles and techniques on the poem now. Firstly, the speaker kind of mentioned this already, but the speaker is talking straight to the boy, the addressee. So it's from I to you. We're using first person pronouns and we're using second person pronouns. So this poem is actually written for that boy, and maybe the speaker is the poet himself, and maybe the boy is his son, and maybe this poem is for the boy to read when he's more mature and older and he can understand a bit more about his father, which gives you a softer perspective on it, because it's kind of like his father trying to justify his behavior, his seemingly strict behavior when the boy is young. Even though it uses I and you, the story is told from quite a removed point of view, so we can see the boy's side as well, or what the father thinks the boy must be feeling, which is why we realize that the boy kind of thinks of the father as an ogre, like a monster type figure. And I think this is a really important thing that comes across with the speaker. He's trying to get across that, yes, the father has a good and a bad side, and a playful and happy and warm, loving, but also a strict, quite stern, cold side. Maybe you wouldn't even call those good and bad, but he has different aspects to his character. And the boy also has that. So we don't know what the boy's done exactly, but regardless of what he's done, whatever it was, he needed some kind of discipline. And as I say, I don't agree with the type of discipline he was given, but I agree with the fact that at some point children need discipline and they need structure. So it's not like the father is just purely bad and the boy is purely good, and the father is the evil kind of villain and the boy is the victim. And that's how the boy sees it at this point, because he's not mature. He's not old enough to understand any different. The father, who is mature, is trying to explore some of these more complex and subtle interpretations of the situation, instead of just saying, I was horrible, or you're stupid, or, that kind of thing. He's trying to see it from different angles and different perspectives. So, with that in mind, we're going to look more at attitudes now, the opinions. So, empathy, I think, is really key, and make sure you understand what this means. You can analyze it, make sure you write it down. It means being able to understand something from someone else's point of view, and that's actually what I was trying to get you to do at the beginning of this lesson, to empathize, to sort of get rid of your personal beliefs for a minute and put yourself in someone else's shoes and see if you can understand why they behave in a certain way. And I think that's the most valuable thing we can get from this poem, the idea of empathy and perspective. So different people have different opinions because of their different backgrounds and upbringings and cultures. So empathy, very important, basically. Make sure you can analyze it. Parenting. I don't know why it says, some of these notes are kind of from my students, so sometimes you might find a note in one of my lessons that doesn't quite make sense. So if you read that and you're like, what on earth does that mean? I've kind of got the same reaction as you. I'm not quite sure. Let me just think. Parenting is a good way to treat a kid. Maybe it means like strict parenting. Like strict parenting is important. We've kind of got that here in a bit more clarity. So, discipline is important for children. They need to learn lessons about life. The father thinks that physical discipline is an acceptable punishment for bad behavior. As I say, I don't think it's necessarily a good idea because it could traumatize the child, it could impact his future relationship. The father is physically a lot stronger than the child. So, personally, I'm against the idea of physical discipline, but I am for the idea of general discipline. Like, I agree that discipline is important for a child. Again, work out your perspective on that. Um, the boy is sad, angry, and confused, so his perspective is very one sided and emotional, whereas the father's perspective is more mature and balanced and complex. This, I think, is really crucial if you are on the side of physical discipline. So, if you think that in some cases physical discipline is fine and it's justified, and this is it's totally acceptable in more kind of old fashioned times. So, there's nothing wrong with having that opinion if that's your culture or your upbringing or your personal conclusion. Um, so the father has no enjoyment in imposing the physical discipline. He actually wants to comfort him and he can't because he feels the boy needs to learn a lesson. So it's really, really important that there's no enjoyment there. It's not like a fun thing for him, it's a duty as a parent. It's his duty to give boundaries and rules and not let his child just get away with everything because that's not a good way to teach a child life lessons. So it's really important, that idea of parenting. And obviously, most students reading this now are not likely to be parents because you're probably reading this when you're, I don't know, like maybe kind of in your mid teens up until your early 20s, likely. So you may be a parent and be studying at the same time. Likely, if you do have children, you'll have them in the future. But regardless of whether you have kids now or not, it's important to kind of think about like how do you behave around children, and if you were to have children, what kind of a mother or father would you be? So, this type of poem helps us explore those family relationships and those attitudes to discipline. And yeah, I was saying I've got lots of animals earlier. if you don't have kids but you have pets, my rule for pets, because I used to run a dog rescue, is that you definitely make sure that you you have like a proper discipline structure in place. Because when I first had rescue dogs and I didn't have any discipline, because I was like, you poor things, I've saved your life and you can just be calm and happy here and do what you want. All the dogs I had went crazy and I couldn't control them, and I was just like super stressed. And then I said, okay, this is enough. I'm going to give you some rules. And if you go to bed when I say you will, and, don't, don't like growl at each other or run away and that kind of thing. As soon as I put all those rules in place, the dogs actually were really calm and really happy and a lot more, and, they got a lot more enjoyment out of life. So discipline is not a thing that is negative, I don't think, for a lot of cultures. And in our modern Western culture, which Mervyn Morris is actually not from, I'll have a look at that in a second, it's quite easy to be like, oh, it's a negative thing and it gives a bad association. I don't think that's true necessarily from my experience with dogs. And like I say, I kind of treat children in a similar way and they behave accordingly. So I have like super nice, lovely relationships with my nieces and nephews because once one of them tried to hit me with a giant dinosaur, and I took the dinosaur toy off him, and I was like, "You can't have this anymore," and he was crying, and it's kind of similar to this situation, really. And obviously, I'd only done like verbal discipline, no physical. But yeah, he's very upset by it, and I felt a bit bad making him feel so upset. But he needs to learn that he can't go around hitting everyone in the face with a giant dinosaur. And that's what kids like. They need those rules. They don't know until they test that boundary. So yeah, think more about these attitudes that are present here, because it helps you to analyze the poem in a deeper level. So finally, we'll have a look at a couple of language structure form points. I've kind of just quickly jotted out the features. So Um, Sometimes I go into more detail in this one, but I think the attitude is really important. So I tried to focus on the attitude in this lesson. So we've got alliteration, we've got onomatopoeia. See if you can find some features there and spend some time going deeper into your typical techniques like repetition, imagery, specific types of vocabulary, maybe a semantic field, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, and go deeper into those techniques in your own time. Maybe as like a little end to this lesson, you can try that. I will say that one of the more complex features that I notice is a fairy tale allegory. So, an allegory is where you're mapping your own story onto someone else's story. So, he's talking about ogres, and it feels a bit like Jack and the Beanstalk or like a fairy tale, like he's this kind of evil thing and the boy is really vulnerable. So, he's sort of playing around with those fairy tale images and those fairy tale tropes that we're used to. So, that's an important thing to analyze. And I did talk about this metaphor of the rain already, so um, that's quite an important final line as well. So the structure is every stanza is a single sentence exploring a different idea, so there is some kind of regularity to the structure. There's also a bit of irregularity as well, so 7 lines, 6 lines, 6 lines, 1 line. The final line at the end is really important. It's kind of like his final statement, I think, where he has his say as a parent, and that's the last message. So even though something is difficult, it's still necessary. And I feel like that's important for the boy, but it's equally important for him to understand that in himself. Like he's trying to be a strong father and a good father by imposing discipline without feeling guilty because he's like, I need to do this. My child has to have some boundaries. So it's really important, that rule, and it's a very important final message, and that's why it's a single line stanza at the end, set off from the rest of the poem. The rest of the poem feels kind of roughly structured. So the lines are like roughly equal length. The stanzas are roughly equal length, 7, 6, 6. So it feels like it's got a rough form to it and a rough structure that he's trying to impose. So it's not 100% totally fixed in place, but it's important that it's got that kind of like feeling like it's been ordered and organized in some way, because that's reinforcing this message of imposing order and discipline um, on your children as a parent, and that's part of your duty. So there's no formal rhyme scheme. There's some assonance, so you want to have a look at that a bit more. Spite, hurt, tight, bright eyes, feet, hint. Soft rhyming, and I feel like this is kind of like a lullaby a bit, and it kind of reinforces that fairy tale feeling to the poetry. Yeah, so you can kind of have a look at that as well, and have a look at punctuation too if you want some more structure form ideas. So context then, as I said, written in 2006. He's a Jamaican poet, and he's quite old now. He's 81 years old. And yeah, this was interesting. I was thinking about this as I was doing the analysis. So the poet was like, he's 81 now. So when he was in his 70s, he wrote this poem. So he's looking back at himself as a father, and he's acting like this to his son, maybe like 30, 40 years ago. Or he's the child and he's thinking about it from his father's attitude. And that makes it even more complex if you kind of look into that, like think about like the fact that he wrote this when he was a lot older. So he's not a parent at this point talking to his 3-year-old son. As I was saying earlier, when you analyze it, like from just reading the poem, that's how it feels. I'd kind of forgotten this, which is why I've just kind of added it now. So yeah, so he actually wrote it when he's super old, not crazy old, 70s, not like ancient, but much older than parent age. So he wouldn't have had a 3-year-old son at the point where he's writing it. So maybe he's thinking about being hit as a child and then understanding his father more, or maybe he's thinking about um, something he did in the past that he maybe still feels guilty about, and he's trying to come to terms with that. So that's quite an important context point. It changes a little bit how you're going to analyze this poem. So make sure that you're aware of that one. So finally, I'm going to actually just put all these onto the same page, these themes. As with most of my lessons, I always end on themes, and I don't have tons here, so feel free to add your own. Oh, they're saying they won't stay still. There we go. Yeah, I've got like 4 that I've kind of split apart. I want you to think about the messages of these themes as a final thing to do with this lesson. So go through those themes and think about how they relate to the poem. Maybe find quotes for the themes as well. And then think about what is his final statement, his final message on each of those themes. So, what does he think about relationships? What does he think about vulnerability? And that will help you form a really nicely structured essay on this poem when you come to analyse it in an exam. So, hopefully, you've enjoyed this lesson and it's kind of made you think a little bit about different ways to be a parent, different family relationships, maybe the relationship with your own parents, maybe thinking of your future self as a parent and what type of parent you'll be. If it's made you think of one or all of those, then it's had a good effect on you, and that's the purpose of poetry. So well done, and hopefully it was enjoyable and interesting for you, and you feel like you've developed a little bit as a person through that process of exploration. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. Hopefully you enjoyed this class, and I'll see you in a future class soon. Goodbye for now.